Welcome. This is Josh Busby, and this is the Horns of the Dilemma. Today, we're going to be talking about a recent report for USAID on the intersection of climate exposure and state fragility.
Hi, I'm Ashley Moran. I'm the State Fragility Initiative Director at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, based here at the University of Texas.
So I'm going to start off with a question for Ashley. Why study the intersection of climate and fragility risks? Why now?
Sure. Well, there are so many places across the globe that have really high climate exposure, right? And some of these places have effective governments in place that can respond and manage those risks and keep their populations safe or help their populations recover if they are affected by climate events. Other places that have high climate risks have fragile governments and fragile relationships between the state and society that really ultimately place these populations at greater risk. So in these fragile states, institutions and mechanisms for responding to public needs are still in development, really. And climate change poses a lot of stress on those institutions and really places multifaceted and prolonged stress on the population that can exceed the state's capacity to address that. So that's what we were looking at here is really that nexus of issues, seeking to identify where the combination of climate and fragility risks are highest around the globe.
And that's really been underscored by the IPCC's recent report. It emphasizes those kinds of connections. It notes that the negative impacts of climate change will likely be larger in near term than initially estimated, and developing countries are most at risk. So how did this study come together? Who all was involved?
So I think it's important to note that our study was part of a broader effort really to understand the links between climate and fragility risks. The G7 commissioned a really groundbreaking report called A New Climate for Peace a few years ago. And that set out this framework for thinking about the integration of climate and fragility risks and what additional challenges that poses for communities and states having to deal with those compound risks. So then USAID commissioned us to get a more detailed global portrait of where these combined climate and fragility risks exist and really how they vary from place to place. So we pulled together a team of people based here at UT or affiliated with UT, and particularly people who have worked with us on prior research that was funded by the U.S. Department of Defense and their Minerva initiative there, where we were looking at climate and security risks in Africa and Asia. And now this gives us an opportunity to look at those risks globally. So I should note that the study here that we're talking about, was of course led by the two of us, along with our colleague Cleona Raleigh, who's based at the University of Sussex, and the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. And we had a great team also on the project: Todd Smith, Nisha Krishnan, Rutabe Kishi, Andrew Link, and Charles White. So it was certainly a collaborative effort here.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in the report and what's special about it. This is the first effort, as far as we know, to map the locations and intensity of combined climate and fragility risks around the world. And so our study provides data on the precise locations experiencing high exposure to multiple climate hazards and the size and share of populations exposed to those risks, and state and society capacity to respond, and potential instabilities that undermine that response capacity. So this effort identifies countries with the highest compound fragility and climate risk relative to the rest of the world, as well as the nature of those combined risks within countries. And I think this is important in understanding where and how people may be more vulnerable to humanitarian emergencies and instability, and how we might best respond. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen more military and aid interventions in states experiencing some combination of fragility and climate exposure, where they needed external support to address their conflicts, upheaval or humanitarian crises. And our hope is that knowing the specific ways that climate and fragility risks intersect offers a new resource for policymakers, and it can help assess how these varied policies promoting peace, political stability, and resilience can best be designed to reinforce each other and reduce both the fragility and climate risks that contribute to instability. And I should note that, there's been a lot of effort to address the causal connections between climate change and conflict in recent years. And this report, on some level, sidesteps that debate and basically identifies countries that face the double burden of climate challenges and fragility, and sets aside, at least for the moment, whether or not the climate changes are causing conflict or instability, but notes that there are countries that are experiencing both problems simultaneously, and that has important implications for the world and the international community and the countries that are affected by these problems. So where are the places at most risk of this double burden of climate and fragility risks?
So this is really interesting. So the highest combined climate and fragility risks are really concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. And the remaining countries facing these combined climate and fragility risks at the highest levels are really dotted across, this line from Northern Africa through the Middle East and Southeast Asia, and then small pockets in South America. And globally, we identified 26 states that have more than 1 million people, or more than 10% of the population, living in high exposure areas. And many of these states are facing particularly high population risks. For example, India has over 100 million people living in high exposure areas. Nigeria has 41 million, Egypt 33 million, and many more countries, for example, DRC, Cameroon, Myanmar, Cambodia, Pakistan, each with many millions of people living in high exposure areas. And many of these also have a large share of the population facing high exposure. And so this is really key because some states, have not only a large number of people, but also large shares of the population, which presents huge challenges for the government. So, for example, Sierra Leone has fully 100% of its population living in high exposure areas. Guinea has nearly 2/3. Cambodia, Cameroon, Egypt all have between a quarter or upwards of a half of their population living in high exposure areas, which places extreme stress on the resources and capacities of the population and government to be able to address that scope of risk to the population.
So I want to talk a little bit about what kinds of climate risks are these countries facing. And this report may not be fully exhaustive in terms of the variety of hazards that countries face, but we did try to incorporate disaggregated data on as many as we could, again, building on previous research that we did under the Department of Defense's Minerva initiative in our CCAPS program on Africa, and as well as our SEPSA program on South and Southeast Asia. So the countries face multiple overlapping climate risks, or at least many of them do. And our measure uses historical data to assess exposure to 6 key climate hazards: cyclones, floods, wildfires, rainfall anomalies, chronic aridity, and low elevation coastal zones susceptible to storm surges and future sea level rise. And so the kind of aggregate measure of exposure provides information on the specific hazards that locations face, as well as their accumulated exposure to the 6 hazards. So we classify countries as having high climate risk when they face a confluence of several climate hazards, as this really poses an extreme burden on states to mobilize prevention, preparedness, and response efforts for many diverse hazards. It's important to note, though, that there are a few highly fragile states that face such exceedingly high exposure to a single climate hazard that it risks exceeding state capacity to address it. I mean, we can think about Yemen, Mali, and Niger all facing chronic aridity, or the Republic of Congo facing reduced rainfall. So let's turn to fragility risks. What kinds of fragility risks are these countries facing?
I think to preface that, it's important to note that we tracked 2 key dimensions of state fragility, and this is in line with how USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which sponsored this study, how USAID has measured and assessed fragility internally for years. And this measure of fragility tracks both state effectiveness on the one hand and state legitimacy on the other. And state legitimacy meaning the public's perception of the government and the government's officials and policies. So we tracked this across security, political, economic, and social spheres, and measured this starting back in 2000 so that we could look at trends in state capacity and legitimacy and which spheres of state operations have deficits and where these deficits are either improving or worsening over time. So among the states with high compound climate and fragility risks, as we might expect, they have very diverse fragility profiles. But what's interesting is looking at it in this way gives us a lot of insight into the specific challenges that each state faces in grappling with not only governance and societal challenges, but also climate risks. So for example, Nigeria has fragility in all four spheres across security, political, economic, and social institutions. Colombia and India, on the other hand, have strong political and social sectors, but fragility in the security sphere. Different kinds of fragility and different kinds of security challenges, but nonetheless, their dominant security deficit is really in the security sphere. And a country like Guinea-Bissau, for example, has strong security, but struggles with ineffective political institutions and challenges in social service delivery. Right. So each of these fragility profiles has distinct implications for addressing climate risks, as addressing climate risks really requires reforms across each of these spheres, right? So it requires reforms to advance adaptation and resilience in the social and economic spheres, reforms to ensure effective political processes that serve as a conduit between public needs and government responses, and a stable security environment in which to operate. So knowing the specific sectors where a state is experiencing fragility can help in designing robust climate policies that won't be undermined by a lack of state capacity in spheres related to the implementation of those climate policies. One other thing I might note here is that while fragility profiles differ across all of these states facing high compound risks, one common pattern is really striking. So among states with high compound fragility and climate risks, fragility stems more from deficits in state legitimacy than from deficits in state capacity. So this means that in those states, the public's perception of the state being unable or unwilling to address its needs contributes more to overall fragility in these states than does actual state capacity and deficits in those state capacity. So state efforts to address public needs for reducing climate vulnerabilities could simultaneously reduce both climate risks and legitimacy deficits that contribute really heavily to fragility in these states. So one possible avenue for thinking about the applications of this research in the policy realm and in analyzing this situation.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the different ways we got at the intersection of climate exposure and state fragility. And this I think, was fairly innovative and one of the exciting aspects of this project. So we sought to do this in a few ways, each providing different insight into this intersection. So we produced something called a bivariate map, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically it combines both dimensions of fragility and climate data in a single map to show all levels of fragility and climate exposure on one map. You really have to see it, so I hope you click on some of the links that accompany this podcast, because when you see them together, the sort of darkest purple ones are the areas on the map that show the combined intersection of fragility and climate exposure. And it provides a global portrait of the relative intensity of both risks across all states. And it does so at the subnational level. So the fragility data is all at the national level, but the exposure data is more finely disaggregated. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Now, we do something else, what we call overlay maps. And we basically classify all the different states in the world in terms of kind of tiers of fragility. And then we show detailed subnational exposure patterns for states in a single fragility category. And so this provides much more detailed data on climate exposure for states in each fragility category. And so it allows you to take the states with the highest fragility and just look at climate exposure in those. And all the other states are sort of grayed out, if you will. And then we do that for the other categories of fragility. But we don't stop there. And we have a couple of other metrics which are interesting. Maps are seductive and they convey certain information that people find attractive. But, when you do a global map, certain things are obscured just given the scale. And there are other metrics that we developed that we think are really important to capture some of these dimensions of the combined intersection of fragility and exposure. So we have population and territory-based metrics to identify the number of people, the share of the population, and the extent of territory facing high and very high exposure. And these provide exposure statistics that can be compared across states. And so that's a really interesting phenomenon that allows us to note that, a country like India has, more than 100 million people facing very high exposure. And you might not see that if you're just looking at the map and focusing on the very dark brown areas that face high climate exposure. India is very densely populated, and so taking note of that with these population-based metrics really provides an important complement to the maps on their own. So can you walk us through an example of a country?
Absolutely. So let's look at a country we already mentioned here, Nigeria, which is a really good example of a state with among the highest compound climate and fragility risks. It has amongst the highest fragility globally. And it has very high exposure to multiple overlapping risks across the territory. As you mentioned, Josh, flooding, drought, variable rainfall, wildfires, coastal inundation, all are present in Nigeria in different parts of the state and really overlapping. So governments from the local to the national level are really challenged to be meeting public needs and responding to these really diverse climate hazards. And meanwhile, this longstanding environmental stress is coupled with, unfortunately, poor government management of that and other stressors that have contributed to the instability that we now see in Nigeria related to several food crises and land conflicts. And this just provides an example of how dangerous feedback loops can emerge between fragility and climate challenges. To provide one example, within Nigeria, if we look at the north of the country, it's an area affected by really high chronic aridity and variable rainfall, and it has high overall exposure, both within the country and globally, but it's not the most climate vulnerable part of the country, right? We see that current emergency conditions and famine risk there are driven instead by continued political violence, disrupting harvests and aid supplies, really for years, rather than by climate factors alone. So this suggests something interesting when we look at, fragility and climate factors coming together. At least in this part of Nigeria, it suggests that the current challenge here in the north is not necessarily that climate stress is insurmountable or that local agricultural approaches or foreign aid interventions are ineffective, but that particular aspects of the state's fragility, in this case, the government's inability to maintain security and address interconnected political and socioeconomic issues that lead to conflict, that these aspects of state fragility are really undermining resilience in this area. And we see similar dynamics in other parts of Nigeria across the Middle Belt and in the Niger Delta that likewise have both climate and fragility components to the ongoing crises there.
We did a short report on what our data say about Nigeria, and we did two other small mini cases on Bangladesh and Colombia, and I would commend each of those to you. I should note that all three of them are based mostly on desk research and aren't a deep dive into country dynamics in terms of complemented by ground truthing and field work, but they do give you a feel for what are the diverse exposure challenges in these states and how that intersects with state fragility. And as I just mentioned, Bangladesh is another one. It's often seen as ground zero for the climate change struggle. You have a very densely populated country that has a large extent of its territory subject to flooding, to low elevation coastal zones, to cyclone risks. And the politics in the country are are really interesting, some of which we get into in the report and also in some recent case studies that we've done for our SEPSA project as well. You've had political challenges in the country and security challenges that have emerged of late that are really testing Bangladesh's capacity to kind of govern itself and tamp down on violence. The other side of that equation is you've seen in the climate space, the country has made heroic strides in trying to insulate itself from the kinds of challenges associated with, say, cyclone risks, where, at its sort of violent, painful founding and breakaway from Pakistan had severe violence, and even dating back to the early 1990s, large numbers of people died as a result of exposure to cyclones. In recent years and decades, the state has done an admirable job in reducing the risk of large-scale loss of life. But still, this is a country that is experiencing really difficult challenges in managing these, largely because leaving aside all the fragility challenges that I mentioned in terms of governance, you just have such a large proportion and such large absolute numbers of people who live in areas that are exposed to all these kinds of climate risks that I talked about before. I encourage you to take a look at those mini cases that we did as part of this report, and I'd also encourage you to look at the SEPSA short case we did on Bangladesh. I wanted to come back to something that was surprising in this report. And I think, what was surprising for me is that, and maybe it's not so surprising if we think about the events that are ongoing in the western part of the United States at the moment with the wildfires, or what the U.S. has experienced over the past couple of years with Hurricane Harvey in our neck of the woods, Irma, and Maria that buffeted Puerto Rico. But the United States and China are among the countries with the largest numbers of people facing very high exposure. So while they're less fragile, they're some of the richest countries in the world face substantial climate challenges. And I think this is something that the United States has been tested mightily by these confluence of overlapping climate hazards in recent years, and hasn't really been up to that challenge. If you think about 3,000 people dying in Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And this is the United States, the richest country in the world. And so we can think about how the U.S. has tried to respond to these challenges, but been really tested. And countries that are less wealthy and less stable, that have high fragility, if they face such grave challenges, it's going to really test them. Now, there's another dynamic that I think is not entirely surprising, but it's illuminating. One of the things that happens is that countries that have less than, say, 500,000 in population often don't have data collected for them for state fragility. So not very surprising on some level, but illuminating is how our study affirmed the grave risks that climate hazards pose to low-lying islands. And while less fragile, countries like the Maldives, the Marshall Islands, and Kiribati have among the highest population shares globally, facing very high exposure. And those are almost impossible to see on a global map of exposure, just because they're so small, your eyes are not drawn to islands. Likewise for territories like the Cayman Islands, Cocos Islands, and the Northern Mariana Islands, which just experienced their worst typhoon on record with Typhoon Yutu. They have very high populations that have high exposure. And related to that is some of the fragility metrics that the World Bank and others collect don't include data on countries that have small populations. And so some of those countries won't even show up on the fragility data at all. And if we ignore the extreme exposure of low-lying island nations, we're going to miss some really important countries that for whom climate change is an existential challenge. And in the next 20 or 30 years, they'll likely cease to exist, or at least cease to be viable, and their populations will have to move and find new places to live. So I want to turn and ask you, okay, so how can policymakers use this report?
Absolutely. So we hope in a few different ways. We've thought about this a lot and really think that looking at climate and fragility risk together allows us to see how vulnerability can be compounded by these intersecting risks, but also where resilience initiatives can impact both climate and fragility challenges. So this then provides a broadened set of strategies for reducing fragility, if we look at it that way, right? So if we carry on our example of Nigeria, this is one of the states, like most of the states with high compound risks, that has high state legitimacy deficits, if that makes sense, or really large state legitimacy deficits that contribute more to overall fragility than the deficits in state capacity. And again, this is common across the majority of states with high compound climate and fragility risks. So this is interesting because this provides a possible opportunity for intervention in that state actions that respond to the public needs for reducing climate vulnerabilities. So, for example, reducing populations' physical exposure along the coastlines, or improving access to clean water in areas where facing chronic water scarcity. These are steps that could reduce both climate risks and the legitimacy deficits that drive fragility in Nigeria and other countries where legitimacy is really driving fragility. And a second key area I would point to in how this report could be applied by policymakers is that looking again at this intersection of climate and fragility risks allows us to see how climate policies may be most effectively implemented in a given state. So if we're able to identify the strongest facets of governance in a state, whether that's in the political sphere or security or economic or social sphere, that presents an opportunity for action to reduce climate risks through reforms in that sphere. And so I'll give you an example of Colombia. In Colombia, there are small pockets of very high exposure and large numbers of people exposed in those areas. And as we know, the government has been grappling with longstanding conflict there and new sources of violence. And many of these climate risks have not been adequately addressed, despite there being really predictable patterns to these recurrent flooding and coastal inundation in areas that, again, have really high density populations. So Colombia also has really strong political and social institutions and strong capacity in those areas. So this could be an area where Colombia can leverage its strong political institutions and strong political capacity to adopt policies that specifically address the climate risks that are known to be facing large numbers of people in areas of Colombia. And it can leverage its social institutional capacity to implement those policies across the country. So this is just one idea about ways that, looking at the facets of states where the states have the strongest capacity can help us think about where climate policies may be best implemented, at least in the initial stages, and really get some traction in creating change and addressing the needs of the population.
You might not have thought about this, but I'm teaching an environmental security class at the moment, and Lake Chad has come up a lot. So thinking back to this Nigeria example, and one of the questions that's come up is, what's the proper sequencing of action? Like, obviously, the Lake Chad region that faces northern Nigeria and other countries in the region is one in which obviously very difficult climate and other environmental challenges that aren't related to climate, like environmental degradation, but you also have severe conflict ongoing, and all of the countries that are in the Lake Chad Basin are very fragile. So is dealing with the climate aspects of this a way to ameliorate the conflict, or do you have to put an end to the conflict first as a means of being able to deal with the kind of water management issues associated with Lake Chad? And I don't know if you have an answer to this, but it's something that we've wondered about in our class. And so just thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's the $50 million question, right? If we had an answer to that, it would be gold. But I think the key thing to think about there is that, particularly for a country like Nigeria and other countries where there are multiple ongoing conflicts, this signals a serious lack of state capacity in many areas, not just the security sphere, but also across economic and social and political spheres that where capacity is needed to address issues that lead to conflict. right? So I think in countries like Nigeria, where we're facing multiple conflicts, the sequencing question aside, which is particularly thorny, and I'm going to try to sidestep that myself, what is clear is that institutional reforms are really critical to be able to build state capacity in these areas where the state currently is not able to address the needs of the population before any climate policies that are already underway or any new climate policies that could better address the multifaceted needs of the public can really get traction without being undermined by these deficits in other areas of the state.
It raises interesting questions about, can you build, say, water management capacity as a route to state capacity in the midst of a hot conflict? We read a recent New Yorker piece on the Lake Chad situation, had some tremendous field work involved, and it kind of leaves you with some desperate takeaways, at least for that particular problem. But that may be one of the hardest ones that anyone would have to face in this space. Other countries and other regional problems like that one may be a little bit more manageable. One of the things I wanted to raise is that, if this is perceived ultimately as something that requires, if these suite of problems that are related to climate hazards ultimately require military solutions, then a host of other things have gone wrong. And so, it really points to the fact that dealing with the climate side of these problems typically requires other investments first in disaster risk reduction, in conflict mediation, and climate proofing of infrastructure. If none of those things have happened, if states haven't invested in disaster preparedness or risk reduction, there hasn't been investment in early warning systems. If those efforts to climate proof infrastructure haven't happened, if there haven't been investments by states or international actors in adaptation measures to buttress agricultural livelihoods and diversify sources of incomes, if there aren't social safety nets present for people in times of need, if the government hasn't developed sort of inclusive mechanisms to ensure different societal groups have a stake in their government, if those things haven't happened, then it becomes the military's problem, and that's sort of a tools of last resort that are not necessarily best designed for this suite of problems, but they are frequently called upon in disaster situations or in conflict situations. But that's sort of an expensive set of tools. And if we over rely on those instruments in our arsenal of tools, either at the national or international level, if that's all we invest in, then it will become the military's problem. And so we hope this report helps identify places that need those kinds of investment before it becomes the military's job to provide humanitarian assistance or help resolve conflicts. And this analysis should also help security and development professionals think about places where those responses are likely to be inadequate, where policies may indeed fail, and what kinds of emergency responses are likely going to be required, which we hope encourages conversations about dispute settlement and building more inclusive governance in countries that need it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important fundamental point there. And our report, I hope, provides some new tools for analyzing that, right? So if we want to think about ways to prevent new compound climate fragility risks from starting in new areas, right? We thought we could look at building the capacity of states that have today moderate fragility and very high climate exposure. So moderately fragile states like Bangladesh, which you noted, China, Russia, Venezuela, the Philippines, have really large populations facing very high exposure. And climate hazards thus place really extreme stress on these states, which are already coping with other substantial stressors that have placed them in the moderate fragility category. So if fragility worsens in these states and they're not able to effectively address their climate risks, large numbers of people will be more vulnerable to the very high climate exposure risks they already face. So we're hoping that this report and these data provide an additional way to be focusing on proactive interventions and investing early in prevention, much to your point there.
Final word, the way I think about mapping projects is maps provide an opening for a conversation and aren't the final word. I always think that it's important to complement them with ground truthing and field-based work because local actors will have a better appreciation of the geography of these combine risk much better than what any data set can tell you. But for international audiences that may be concerned about a diverse array of places and need to think about how to prioritize places of concern within a suite of issues and countries, we hope the reports like this one give them some guidance, but we wouldn't stop there. If you think that the particular countries that surface from our list of high fragility countries that have very high climate exposure, we hope that policymakers will invest in deeper dives into those places so that the policy remedies can be tailored to those specific circumstances, because there's just much more complexity than what any set of maps or even the complementary case studies can tell you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think dovetailing with that, I would just note that in these states with high compound risks, the feedback loops between climate and fragility risks really have to be considered in policy interventions, lest progress in one area be undermined by a lack of progress in another. So our hope is that policies that account for these intersecting climate and fragility risks can create additional prospects for successfully building resilience while reducing fragility and preventing the onset of new risks.
Well, we thank you for listening and look forward to further contributions down the road.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.